The holidays are supposed to be a time for family, warmth, and good food. But sometimes, they turn into a backdrop for the kind of fear you never really shake off. Let us start with a trip that took place on a Thanksgiving a few years ago. I was on my way to my girlfriend's parents' house. I had been invited to their Thanksgiving dinner, which was a huge honor for me. At that point, I had only met her parents 3 times, so I was incredibly nervous. To make things even more stressful, her grandparents, aunts, and uncles were also going to be there, and I had never met any of them. We had a long drive ahead of us, lasting about an hour. About 45 minutes into the drive, my gas gauge was getting low, so we had to stop. We pulled up to a dead Gulf station right off the highway. It was quiet, dark, and felt completely isolated. I decided to fill up with premium for once, just to do my car a favor. Knowing it was cheaper to pay with cash, I grabbed my wallet and walked inside the station. My head was down as I dug my hand inside my wallet, searching for a $10 and a $20 bill. When I finally pulled the bills out, I instinctively looked up and said, 30 on 2, but I stopped mid-sentence. There was absolutely no one behind the register. I looked around, searching for a bell on the counter, but there was none. I simply called out, "Is anyone there?" There was no answer. The strange part was that there was not even a back door behind the counter. Usually, you would assume a door there would lead to an employees-only room, but it was just a solid wall. The only other door in this entire little gas station was a single bathroom, and that door was wide open, exposing nothing but complete blackness from within. I figured maybe whoever was manning the register had just gone outside for a quick second. So, I walked back outside and shrugged my shoulders at my girlfriend, who was sitting in the car. I looked around the property, thinking there might be an ice machine or a portable toilet, distracting a potential cashier. But there was nothing. It was a relatively small station surrounded by dense woods in almost all directions. I went behind the building to check by the dumpster under a dimly lit roof light, but there was nobody there. I decided I would just pay with my credit card at the pump instead. But as I turned around, someone from out in the dark woods called over to me in a kind of whispery, raspy yell, "Hey, hey!" It kept coming from deep within the trees. I took out my phone and flipped on the flashlight to skim the outer tree line. The beam of light momentarily revealed someone standing behind a tree, watching me. I took off running back to the car, hopped inside, and immediately stepped on the gas to get out of there. My girlfriend was scared out of her mind. As we sped down the highway, I told her about the bizarre and terrifying thing that had just happened, and she kept looking through the rearview mirrors to make sure we were not being followed. We pulled up to the next gas station we could find. This one actually had a cashier working inside. I paid him $30 and went back outside to fill up my tank. But a large van pulled up right behind mine, and a man wearing a cap stepped out, staring intently at me. I tried to act as if I did not notice him, but he kept staring for at least 20 seconds. I looked at him and asked if there was a problem. He finally turned away. We made it to her parents' house safely. But a few weeks later, I found out that a 33-year-old Indian man who worked at that first gas station had been murdered. His body had been stuffed in the woods right behind the station, around the exact time we were there. I immediately gave the police a tip about the strange man at the second station, who was surely caught on camera. The following year on Thanksgiving, a similar murder happened at another gas station. We nicknamed him the Thanksgiving Killer, and he has still not been caught. Let us move on to the next story. It is a well-known fact that Walmart attracts some of the absolute weirdest and most unpredictable people, especially during major shopping events like Black Friday. My brothers and I had decided to go video game shopping to see if we could score some good deals. Our first and only stop for the night was the local Walmart. The place was absolutely mobbed when we arrived. And being Walmart on Black Friday, it was crowded with the absolute worst kinds of people. There were rude, strange, and downright creepy individuals everywhere, all pushing and shoving, just to save a few bucks on already cheap products. My brothers and I went upstairs to the video game section. Personally, I was looking for the latest Call of Duty game, while my brothers were looking for a different game that I cannot quite remember now. We were standing by the display cases, browsing through the titles, when out of nowhere, a heavy older man walked right up to me. He smelled strongly of vomit, and his physical appearance was incredibly disheveled. He looked at me and said, "You like video games, huh?" I was instantly uncomfortable. I answered with a short yeah and began to slowly slide away. But the man did not take the hint. Instead, he took a step closer and said, "My son likes video games too. Maybe you should come over to our house and play some games with him. He really craves company." As he said this, he gave me a deeply unsettling, creepy smile. I panicked a little and tried to think of an excuse to get away. I told him, "Oh no, I am not from around town, sorry." That was the only lie I could come up with on the spot. I did not want to give him a single chance to keep the conversation going. I simply gave him a quick smile, called out my brother's name, and walked away to make it seem like I was distracted by something else. Before I rounded the corner, I did a quick glance backward. The man was still standing in the exact same spot, just staring at me as I walked away. I made it to the next aisle over, and immediately felt a sense of comfort being next to my brothers again. I waited around with them until they finally found the game they wanted, and then we all headed down to the checkout counters. The lines were absolutely insane. I knew it would probably take at least 10 to 15 minutes just to make it to the front of the line to pay. Since my brothers were holding our spot, I took that opportunity to wander off and check out some of the clothing sales, specifically looking at some cheap jeans and t-shirts nearby. At one point during my browsing, I found myself in what was probably the most secluded and quiet corner of the entire clothing department. I was looking through a rack of t-shirts when suddenly, someone reached out and grabbed my arm incredibly hard. My immediate reaction was that it was one of my brothers playing a joke and messing with me. I turned around quickly, fully prepared to tell him to back off. But it was not my brother. It was the same creepy man from the video game section. I started panicking. I began calling out for help, screaming as loud as I could that I did not know this man and that he needed to let go of me. A few shoppers nearby walked over and just stared at us, but nobody actually did anything to help or intervene. Fortunately, the commotion was enough to scare the man. He let go of my arm and quickly walked away, disappearing into the crowd. I stood there shaking. I had no idea what he was thinking or what he was planning to do to me in such a public place. I decided not to tell my brothers what had happened out of sheer embarrassment and confusion, but they easily picked up on the fact that I was extremely quiet and distant afterward. When they asked me what was wrong, I just kept telling them it was nothing. We paid for our items and walked out to the parking lot. We got into my brother's Chevrolet Camaro. As soon as I sat down in the passenger seat, I looked out the window toward the main entrance of the Walmart, and there he was. The creepy man was sitting on a concrete bench right outside the doors, facing directly toward our car. As we started driving out of the parking lot, our exit route forced us to pass right in front of the store entrance. I got one last look at him. His head moved ever so slightly, tracking my exact position through the car window as we drove by. I gave him the finger, but he just kept staring. That was the last time I ever saw him. Let us move on to the third story, which took place during Black Friday in the year 2013. I decided to get up at 3 in the morning to catch holiday deals at Home Depot. They were having crazy deals on artificial Christmas trees, and I wanted to get one for my family. I found a nice 9-foot tree for half off, and an employee helped me carry the box to my car. The parking lot was empty. I tipped the employee and got in my car. Suddenly, a tall young man in a black beanie knocked on my window asking for change. My console was empty, so I told him I did not have anything. He looked disappointed and asked if I could give him a lift to the nearest gas station. Even though I was nervous, I decided to let him in. He did not say thank you. I put the car in drive and asked if he knew of any gas stations. He just muttered, "Nah." When I asked why he needed to go to a gas station, he completely ignored me. I felt extremely uncomfortable as I drove, and I could tell he was staring intensely at me the entire time. I finally saw a gas station, but the light turned red. I decided to summon up the courage to look at him, and his cold, emotionless stare ran straight through me. I asked if he was okay, and he ever so slightly nodded. When the light turned green, I pulled into the gas station. He got out and stood on the sidewalk, watching me as I drove away. I quickly realized my phone was missing from the cup holder. I drove back, but he was gone. My phone had all my personal info on it. The next night, after returning from our delayed Thanksgiving dinner, I found my front door open and my entire house trashed. I called the police from a neighbor's phone. They found fingerprints everywhere, but they did not match anyone on record, leaving us with the terrifying reality of an unidentified predator knowing exactly where we live. Now, let us move on to the final story. This one also took place on Thanksgiving. I was hosting a holiday dinner at my house with my family and our next-door neighbors, Tom and his wife. After we all finished eating, the adults sat in the living room to watch the football game, except for my daughters Tracy and Michelle, who were 16 and 13. During halftime, I went upstairs to Michelle's room to convince her to come down and join us. A bit later, Tom and I went outside to smoke. Tom mentioned that his teenage son Sam had decided to go back to their house next door to watch some movies, joking that he was probably watching adult videos. As we talked, I looked up at the window of Michelle's bedroom. I froze. There was a silhouette of someone standing in the dark, looking straight out of her window down at us. Knowing it was not Michelle, I quickly ran inside and went up to her room. Michelle followed me. The room was empty. I asked if anyone had been in here, and she said no. We went back downstairs, but as the game restarted, we heard a sudden, faint thud from upstairs. I ran back up, with Michelle behind me. I turned on the lights and noticed the sliding closet door was cracked open. I squinted past the shadows, and my blood ran cold. I was looking directly at a human eye staring back at me through the crack. I let out a loud scream, and Michelle started screaming too. Relatives rushed up the stairs as I violently slid the closet door open and dragged Sam out by his neck. He was clutching several private, personal belongings of my 13-year-old daughter. Tom ran in and found me holding his son. That incident completely ruined my friendship with Tom and his wife, and we never spoke again. It made me incredibly protective over my daughters, realizing that sometimes the biggest threats do not come from strangers, but from the people living right next door. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. If there is one thing modern technology has taught us, it is that home safety is fragile. Doorbell cameras are meant to give us peace of mind, letting us see packages or arriving friends. But sometimes they capture deeply unsettling things, revealing hidden dangers lurking right outside. These cameras show that having a suspicious stranger show up at your house at night is far more common than most of us want to believe. For example, one quiet night, a homeowner was awakened by a notification on his phone. Looking at his doorbell camera feed, he saw a man walking up his porch steps. The man was holding a plastic bag and a roll of toilet paper. It was obvious that something was wrong. His movements were twitchy and erratic, and he looked incredibly nervous. It was clear he was under the influence of a heavy drug like meth. The homeowner kept the door locked and spoke through the intercom, asking how he could help. The man on the porch had a blank, confused look, his pupils completely dilated from being heavily intoxicated. When the homeowner asked for his name, the man struggled to put his thoughts together, finally saying his name was James. When asked who he was looking for, James froze, trying to invent a story. He mumbled the name Sosa, then added Sammy like the baseball player. The homeowner did not waste time. He told James no friend of his lived there, and that he had a Glock ready if James did not get off his porch immediately. The threat of force worked, and James quickly turned around and left, leaving the homeowner safe. But while some encounters involve confused individuals, others are highly coordinated and incredibly dangerous. In another neighborhood, a home security camera caught something straight out of a nightmare. 3 masked men, all dressed in dark clothing, slowly crept up to a front door in the dead of night. The man in the lead was heavily armed, carrying what appeared to be an assault rifle. He was not there to knock or ask questions. He was preparing to break in and rob the residence. As the lead gunman got close to the door, he noticed the camera. He quickly reached out with his gloved hand and covered the lens, trying to block the view. But even though the camera was covered, the suspects made a critical mistake. Their body language, caught just before the lens was blocked, showed a lot of hesitation. The gunman with the assault rifle seemed to realize they had already been spotted. He started to back away, but one of his accomplices behind him motioned for him to go back and keep trying. Eventually, realizing they lost the element of surprise, they fled. Sometimes, the threat does not come from a random criminal, but from someone you actually know. A viewer submitted a highly disturbing video where a man is seen standing on a front porch, muttering and cursing to himself. He stood there for 15 straight minutes, pacing back and forth. The backstory is terrifying. Not long before this, a member of the homeowner's family had been viciously attacked and mauled by a pack of aggressive dogs, suffering at least 12 bite wounds. The man on the porch was the owner of those dogs. Instead of showing remorse, the dog owner was furious that the family was holding him accountable. He stood on their porch, ranting about how people did not understand things. He muttered that he never denied his dogs bit her, but he was angry that the neighbors wanted to put his dogs to sleep over what he called a simple dog bite. He even made a chilling statement, asking when he had ever threatened her, while pointing out that he knew exactly where she lived. He continued his angry, unstable rant until the police finally arrived to deal with him. Another terrifying incident shows why you must always pay attention to your surroundings. A young couple was walking back to their house after an evening out. They had no idea that a man and a woman wearing wigs had been following them for blocks. The couple made it to their front step and were about to open the door when the male suspect ran up behind them. He pulled out a gun and pointed it directly at the back of their heads. Fortunately, the couple reacted instantly. They scrambled inside their house and slammed the door shut, locking it just in time. The two attackers, realizing they had lost their chance, did not seem bothered. In fact, they laughed as they ran back to their getaway car. Just minutes after this failed attempt, they successfully robbed another person at gunpoint. Thankfully, their luck ran out. The next day, after the doorbell footage was broadcast on the news, a viewer recognized the male gunman and turned him in to the police. Sometimes, criminals try to use authority to gain access to a home. In an apartment complex, a man walked up to a door and knocked loudly. He began shouting that he was the police, hoping the resident would open up without thinking. But as he looked around, he noticed the doorbell camera pointing right at him. His face fell. He realized his disguise and his actions were being recorded in high definition. To try and cover his tracks, he muttered that he was at the wrong room and quickly walked away, hoping the excuse would save him. But perhaps the most chilling home invasion occurred on September 14th, 2022, in Virginia. An elderly couple was spending a quiet evening at home when two armed, masked men burst through their door. They had no regard for the couple's age or vulnerability. They held them at gunpoint and ordered them to get into a closet. The elderly woman was terrified, not just for herself, but for her husband. She pleaded with the robbers, explaining that her husband had recently undergone hip surgery and could not move quickly. The elderly man struggled to stand, doing his best to cooperate so they would not shoot them. He slowly made his way to the closet, feeling completely helpless. Once the couple was locked inside, the robbers moved with disturbing speed and precision. They knew exactly what they wanted. One of them grabbed a heavy safe, while the other took a wallet and the couple's cell phones. Inside that safe was tens of thousands of dollars. The money did not belong to the elderly couple, but to another individual who was staying at their residence. The fact that the robbers went straight for the safe made it clear that this was a targeted tip-off. Someone who had been inside the house, perhaps a contractor, a healthcare worker, or a casual visitor, had seen the safe and shared the information with the criminals. Police launched an intense investigation and quickly identified the two suspects as 25-year-old Mitchell Boney Jr. and 22-year-old Tyree Demons Boney Jr. Mitchell Boney Jr. eventually turned himself in to the police. He was charged with armed burglary, use of a firearm, abduction, and conspiracy to commit burglary. However, Tyree Demons Boney Jr. went on the run and managed to evade capture. The incident left the elderly couple deeply traumatized, showing how quickly a peaceful evening can turn into a nightmare, and how dangerous it is when the wrong people gain information about your home. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. In high school, keeping up with friends online is everything. For most teenagers, apps like Snapchat are just a normal part of daily life. You use it to send quick photos, share jokes, and keep in touch. But a few years ago, the app introduced a feature called Snap Maps. If you had it turned on, anyone on your friend list could see your exact location on a map in real time. Most people did not think twice about it. They just wanted their friends to see they were busy or hanging out somewhere cool. It seemed like a fun, harmless way to stay connected. But the truth is, this simple feature was about to turn several teenagers' lives into absolute living nightmares. At this school, there was a kid named Zach. Zach had been a socially awkward reject since elementary school. No one really knew if he had any specific issues, but everyone agreed there was always something off-putting and unpleasant about him. One cold December day, the narrator got a notification that Zach Meister added him as a friend on Snapchat. The narrator decided to add him back because he was just too friendly of a person. That was his first mistake. Minutes later, Zach sent him a picture and a video. The narrator waited a few hours to show as much disinterest as possible before opening them. When he finally did, it was weirder than he thought. The first picture was of the narrator sitting in the lunchroom. The video showed the moment the bell rang and everyone got up. The camera zoomed in on the narrator, recording him as he left the lunchroom. The caption at the bottom read, "Acute ulul." The narrator ignored it, even though he was close to unfriending him. Later that night, the narrator was watching television in his bedroom and messaging other friends. Suddenly, a message from Zach popped up. By reflex, the narrator tapped the notification. Immediately opening the chat, the message from Zach asked a direct question. "You live on Mason Street." The narrator, caught off guard, replied with a simple yes. Zach answered back instantly. This time, the narrator decided he would not open the chat. He planned to leave it unread for a long time. But Zach did not stop. He kept sending message after message, and then he started sending pictures. The narrator turned his phone screen down on his desk, turned off his television, and went to sleep, hoping the silence would discourage Zach. The next morning, the narrator woke up and immediately felt a freezing draft. He looked up and saw that his bedroom window was wide open. He looked over to his closet, and the door was wide open too. He mumbled to himself in confusion, because he knew he had closed both of them before going to bed. He picked up his phone and saw a long list of new notifications from Zach. A terrible feeling settled in his chest. He opened Snapchat and went straight to Zach's messages. There was a series of photos. The first was a picture of the sidewalk outside. The next was a picture of the narrator's house. Then, a picture of the bedroom window from the outside. The next photo was taken through the window, showing the narrator asleep in his bed. The next photo showed Zach standing inside the bedroom. The final photo was taken from inside the closet, looking out at the narrator sleeping in his bed. Zach had actually climbed through his window, walked around his room, and stood inside his closet while he slept. There were also many text messages. Zach asked why it took so long to answer, and said he was going to come visit because the narrator had his snap map turned on. He wrote that he liked watching people sleep. The narrator screenshotted the chat, but did not think to screenshot the disappearing photos in time. He blocked Zach and told his parents. His dad immediately contacted the police, which turned into a big investigation that got the school involved. Apparently, Zach lived with a single alcoholic father, which explained a lot. The screenshots of Zach admitting he found the narrator via snap maps served as enough proof to get him charged with juvenile breaking and entering. No one ever saw Zach at school again after that, and it was assumed they moved far away. But this was not the only time a high school student found themselves targeted through the app. In another town, a different student had been using Snapchat for about a year to share funny moments from his daily life. At his school, there was a notorious student named Alex. Alex was known for acting like a complete psycho, once even putting a dead rat in another student's locker as a prank. Because of his bowl cut and extremely pale skin, students called him Vampire Bill. He had a long history of school suspensions for aggressive behavior. One afternoon, the narrator of this second story was playing video games when his phone buzzed. It was a notification from Alex. The narrator did not remember adding him, but he realized they were connected on the app because he had put his Instagram link in his bio, which contained his snap code. He put his phone down and kept playing his game. Once his character died, he picked up his phone to see what Alex had sent. It was a highly zoomed-in photo of a door handle and a locking mechanism. The caption simply said, "Hello." The narrator felt a chill. He knew Alex was unstable and capable of showing up at someone's house. He screenshotted the image and replied, asking why he sent it. Alex immediately replied with another picture. This one was a blurry photo taken through a window, looking directly into a kitchen. The narrator froze as he recognized his own family kitchen. The narrator took a screenshot of the kitchen photo and ran out of his bedroom straight to the kitchen. He looked out the window and saw Alex standing on his deck laughing. He ran to the dining room door and threw it open. Alex was standing right there, but he was holding his hand behind his back. The narrator yelled at him to get off the property. Instead of leaving, Alex slowly brought his hand out from behind his back. He was holding a large kitchen knife. The narrator slammed the heavy dining door shut, locked it immediately, and screamed through the glass that he was calling the police. Alex just smiled a wide, unsettling smile and slowly walked off the deck. The narrator ran around the entire house, ensuring every single door and window was locked. He never found out what Alex would have done if the door had not been locked in time, but the memory stayed with him forever. The third case happened just a couple of days ago to a young man who shared his life online. He had a large following on Instagram because he lived a fairly lavish lifestyle and posted pictures of his family's expensive sports cars, high-end watches, and designer clothes. Because of this, he often put his Snapchat username in his Instagram bio, leading to many random friend requests. One rainy night, while hanging out with a friend, he received 2 new friend requests from accounts named Casey Welsh and Bree Owens. He added them both back. He noticed they both had incredibly low Snap scores, one with only 200 points and the other with a few thousand. He thought it was strange because low scores usually mean fake or burner accounts, but he did not worry too much. Later, the account named Casey sent him a snap with a black screen and a caption saying, "You're cute." He decided to ignore it, suspecting someone was playing a joke on him. He opened his Snap map out of curiosity and noticed that both Casey and Bree had their locations turned on. They were apparently together in a car, parked only a short distance away from his current location. When it was time for the young man to go home, the storm outside had worsened. The rain was heavy, making the roads slick and dark. He got into his car and merged onto the highway, driving slowly due to the poor visibility. The highway was empty, except for one car that eventually pulled up directly behind him. The car stayed close, matching his speed. The narrator took his town exit, and the car behind him followed. He took a left turn onto his street, and the car made the exact same turn. He pulled into his driveway and turned off his engine. The car behind him did not pass. Instead, it slowed down right in front of his house and came to a stop. His heart began to hammer in his chest. He grabbed his phone, opened Snapchat, and looked at the Snap map. The icons for Casey and Bree were parked directly on top of his house. They had tracked him home using his own shared location. The narrator was terrified. He knew his father was home, but running across the wet driveway to the front door felt too dangerous. He decided to call the house phone instead. His father answered immediately, and the narrator screamed into the receiver, begging him to come outside. As he did, he saw the mysterious car in the street begin to reverse, aligning itself closer to the driveway. Suddenly, the front door of the house flew open, and his father stepped onto the porch. At the sight of his father, the car sped off into the darkness. The narrator ran through the rain into the safety of the house. He asked his father how he knew to come out so fast, and his father asked him who those men were. The narrator was confused. His father explained that as he opened the door, he saw at least 3 large men sitting in the car watching the house. They had used fake female accounts to lure the narrator and track his location, but the nightmare did not end there. The very next night, the narrator woke up to the sound of rustling leaves and trash cans moving outside his window. He lay frozen in his bed, too, to look. Then, a low voice whispered from the darkness of his room, telling him not to move a muscle. It was his father, who had been hiding behind his bed, watching the window. They waited in silence until the footsteps outside retreated and the car drove away. When we look back at these 3 cases, a terrifying pattern emerges. Social media apps are designed to bring people together, but features like live location tracking create perfect tools for stalkers and predators. In Zach's case, a simple confirmation of an address allowed an unstable classmate to navigate directly to a teenager's bedroom window and slip inside undetected. For Alex, the vulnerability of a shared life online turned into an armed confrontation on a family deck. And for the third victim, a coordinated group of men used fake identities to stalk a wealthy target directly to his home, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. These stories show how easily digital footprints can lead danger to our doors. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. If you have ever been to Branson, Missouri, you might know about an old, abandoned theme park called Celebration City. It has been sitting completely empty and decaying for well over a decade now, having closed its doors for good back in 2008. The park was themed after America in the 20th century, and each operating day closed out with a laser and fireworks display. It featured many rides, shows, and attractions, running from May until mid-September. I had been there several times with my family when I was a kid, and when the announcement came that it was closing down, we were all definitely saddened to hear the news. The owners actually tore down most of the roller coasters before officially closing the gates. But even still to this day, most of the physical buildings are still standing there. It is a little-known fact among the locals that it is actually a very cool, albeit forbidden, place to go and explore. I always had this desire to go back and see what was left of the place, and so, one day, I decided I wanted to see it again. I reached out to a close friend named Calvin, who was very on board with the idea of going to check it out. I asked him specifically because he is a family friend, and our families had actually gone to the park together several times when we were younger, so there was a lot of shared nostalgia there. We drove over to the area and decided to park our car in the Steak and Shake parking lot directly across the street. We did this because the theme park parking lot had been closed off with concrete barriers for a long time, and parking there would have been an immediate red flag. It was right around 7 in the evening, and the sun was just beginning to set below the horizon. We did not want to attempt this in broad daylight because we were terrified of getting caught trespassing by local police or running into security. So we waited for twilight. We brought along 2 heavy-duty flashlights tucked into our pockets for when it got completely dark. We watched the traffic, waited for a gap, and when no cars were coming, we quickly jogged across the road. We slipped into the thick grass and the line of trees surrounding the property of the park. It was surprisingly easy to slip inside, and once we got past the tree line, we were standing inside the decaying remains of Celebration City. We stepped over overgrown weeds, thorny bushes, and cracked pavement, seeing the old ticket booths with peeling paint. The rusted metal turnstiles were frozen in time. Walking down the main path where thousands of families used to walk felt like stepping into an alternate reality. The old gift shop still had empty display shelves covered in thick layers of dust. We walked past the empty lake where the water shows used to take place. The water was stagnant and dark. It was incredibly quiet. The only sound was the rustling of our own footsteps on the gravel and the constant, rhythmic chirping of the crickets. Calvin pointed out a building that had a large, cracked window. The sign above it was faded, but we could make out the words diner. We both knew we had to check it out. As it started to get darker, we decided to crawl through one of these broken windows to get inside one of the larger structures. Once we made it inside, we realized we were standing in what used to be the Last Chance Diner. It was pitch black inside, and admittedly, it was extremely creepy. The main front door was closed, locked, and heavily boarded up from the inside. There were random planks of wood and other debris scattered all over the dining floor, almost as if the place was currently being used for storage. Calvin went off to check out the far side of the diner, and I yelled to him that I was going to check out the bathroom. I walked down a short hallway and pushed open the door to the restroom. Immediately, I noticed a very strange, unexplainable smell in the air. It smelled like damp cardboard mixed with something old and rotting. There were 3 individual stalls in the bathroom, and as soon as I stepped inside, I heard a sudden, quiet sound coming from one of them. It sounded like a very small object, perhaps a coin or a small metal screw, being dropped onto the hard concrete floor. I stopped walking, held my breath, and said, "Hello." My voice echoed off the tile walls, but there was no response. I had my flashlight turned on, slicing through the pitch-black room. All 3 of the stall doors were completely closed, but I knew for a fact that something had just made a noise in there. I held the heavy bathroom exit door open with my foot, just in case I needed to run, and then I slowly got down on my knees and aimed my flashlight beam along the floor, underneath the stall doors. My heart jumped into my throat. Underneath the first stall, I saw a pair of worn-out tennis shoes and human legs. I gasped and jumped back, but then I forced myself to look under the other 2 stalls. There were 3 pairs of shoes and legs visible, one in each of the 3 stalls. They were standing completely still, hiding. But then, one of the pairs of legs began to move, as if the person was starting to get down on their knees to look back under the stall door directly at me. I did not stick around to see their face. I bolted out of the bathroom, screaming at Calvin that we needed to leave right now. I climbed back out through the broken window, and Calvin followed right behind me, not asking any questions until we were far away from that building. When we finally reached the car, I told him about the 3 people hiding in the stalls. He tried to make a joke about it, saying they were probably just using the toilet, but I knew he was just trying to cope with how freaked out he actually was. If those were just friendly explorers, they would have said something when I called out. Instead, they stood there in absolute silence, waiting in the dark. We have never returned to Celebration City, and to this day, the memory of those 3 silent figures hiding in the bathroom stalls still haunts me. Now let us move on to another story, this one involving a 30-year-old woman who lived alone in a mid to lower income area. There was some crime in her town, but she did not live in a ghetto. Still, living alone made her feel uncomfortable at times. She did not know many of her neighbors very well, other than the couple living directly next door, who were incredibly nice. The houses across the street, however, were a completely different story, filled with transient renters and sketchy activity. She liked the idea of knowing her neighbors because it made her feel a little safer, especially since she was a big scaredy cat. Her biggest fears of living alone came true one late night in October. It was past 11, and she was lying in bed trying to fall asleep for a work night. Suddenly, she heard the distinct, soft crunching of dry leaves along the side of her house. She tried to tell herself it was just a cat or a raccoon, as there were many animals running around at night, but she could not shake the feeling that the footsteps sounded too heavy and deliberate. They would take a step, pause, and then take another step, as if someone was trying to move without being heard. The following night, she was woken up around midnight by a sharp tapping sound coming from directly outside her bedroom window. It sounded like something solid striking the wooden frame. Because it was October, she still kept her windows cracked open a few inches to let the cool autumn air inside. Out of pure instinct, she sat up in bed and called out, "Who is there?" She listened intently, but there was nothing but dead silence. She got out of bed, lifted the blinds, and peered outside into the darkness, but the side yard was completely empty. At this point, she started to wonder if she was just becoming paranoid over regular house settling noises. She went back to bed and managed to drift off, but later that same night, she was jolted awake again. This time, she heard a scratching and scraping sound coming from the backyard. She quietly slipped out of bed and walked into her small living room, which faced the backyard. The sound grew louder, and then she heard a distinct metallic clicking sound coming from right outside her sliding glass door. She reached out and flipped on the living room light switch, and the noise stopped instantly. She stood there, terrified to pull back the heavy sliding curtain, fully expecting to see a face pressed against the glass. Gathering her courage, she yanked the curtain open like a band-aid. There was no one there. She turned on the backyard floodlight and opened the sliding door to look outside. The yard appeared empty, but then she heard a rustling sound coming from the thick bushes near the back fence. The bushes were far too dense to see through, and she realized that if someone was hiding in there, she was completely exposed. She ran back inside, locked the sliding door, locked her bedroom door, and got back into bed, her heart hammering in her chest. 10 minutes later, a loud, aggressive knock rattled her front door. She froze, refusing to move, and decided that if the person knocked one more time, she would immediately dial 911. Thankfully, the knocking stopped, and she eventually fell into a light, restless sleep. The very next morning, she and her brother went to Best Buy to buy a doorbell camera and an outdoor security camera system. Her brother helped her install them in hidden spots, and slept over in her guest bedroom that night. Around 2 in the morning, her phone vibrated. The app detected motion in her backyard. She opened the live feed and screamed. A man dressed in all black, wearing a hood and gloves, was at her back door trying to pick the lock. Her brother rushed out barefoot, screaming at the top of his lungs. The intruder, startled, had already bolted over the fence and disappeared. They called the police, but because the man wore gloves and kept his face covered by the hood, there were no fingerprints or identifiable features. The police promised to keep a close eye on the area, but the terrifying reality remained. The intruder seemed to know exactly who she was, and she couldn't help but wonder if the person trying to break into her home was actually one of the neighbors living right across the street. She increased her security measures, but the fear never truly left her. Our final story takes us to the home of a 23-year-old whose parents had recently gone through a bitter divorce. As part of the settlement, their mother received 2 of the 5 luxury properties that their father owned, as he was a highly successful real estate mogul. Because of this, the family had beautiful homes scattered all over, and the narrator usually stayed wherever they wanted, but mostly lived at their mother's primary residence. During this particular week, their mother was staying at their beach house, leaving the narrator completely alone in the massive main house. The layout of the house was quite large, featuring a full kitchen, a spacious living room, and 2 bedrooms on the top floor, with an identical setup on the first floor and a large basement below. The narrator's bedroom was located on the upper level, and they primarily used the upstairs kitchen and living room, while their mother kept her personal belongings on the lower level. The house had 3 main entrances, a front door, a back door, and a side entrance that led directly to the outdoor trash cans. The narrator frequently used the side door when taking out the garbage, and occasionally they would forget to lock it on their way back inside. The mystery began when the narrator started noticing that several of their favorite shirts and items of clothing were suddenly missing. They searched through their messy room, checked their car, and even looked through their mother's quarters downstairs, but found absolutely nothing. They called their mother to ask if she had moved any laundry, but she confirmed she hadn't been to the main house in weeks. The narrator figured that perhaps one of their friends had borrowed the clothes without asking, and decided not to worry too much about it. Because they were alone in the massive house, they always slept with their bedroom door slightly cracked open so they could easily hear any unusual noises if anyone tried to break in. One night, while lying in bed watching a movie on their laptop, they watched as the bedroom door slowly but firmly swung shut. It did not slam, but it closed with enough force that it couldn't have been a simple breeze, even though the ceiling fan was on and the windows were open. Then, they heard the distinct sound of quiet footsteps coming from the hallway outside. It sounded like someone was walking slowly on the hardwood floor, right outside their bedroom door. Instead of hiding, the narrator got out of bed, opened the door, and turned on the hallway light. The hallway was completely empty. They walked down the stairs to their mother's level, searching the dark rooms, but found nothing out of the ordinary. However, as they walked past the basement door, they noticed it was standing slightly ajar. The basement was a space they rarely used, containing only a couch, a television, a few workout machines, and a small room with a punching bag. It also featured 4 large storage closets and a very small, low-clearance crawl-space door that required a person to crouch down low to enter. The narrator walked down the wooden basement stairs and stood in the quiet room. Out of the corner of their eye, they saw the tiny door to the crawl space move slightly. Their hearts stopped. They froze in place, staring at the small wooden door. Suddenly, a pale human hand reached out from the pitch-black darkness of the crawl space, grabbed the edge of the door, and pulled it slowly and silently shut from the inside. The narrator quietly and carefully backed up the stairs, trying not to make a single sound, and bolted out of the house to call 911. Within minutes, 4 police officers arrived at the scene with their lights flashing but sirens silenced. They entered the basement with weapons drawn and ordered the intruder inside the crawl space to surrender. The small door slowly creaked open, and a bald, 50-something-year-old man with a squished-looking face and a tiny nose crawled out onto the basement floor with his hands raised. He was wearing one of the narrator's missing shirts. When the officers searched the cramped crawl space, they discovered a makeshift living area filled with a massive stash of the narrator's and their mother's clothing, personal belongings and food wrappers. The entire space smelled heavily of urine, indicating that the man had been living inside the walls of the home for weeks, coming out to steal clothes and watch the narrator sleep while they were alone. The man was arrested and charged with third-degree burglary. The narrator realized that they had likely left the side door unlocked after taking out the trash one night, allowing the intruder to slip inside unnoticed. They immediately threw away all the contaminated clothing and learned a valuable, terrifying lesson about the importance of locking every single door, because you never truly know who might be slipping into your home when you aren't looking. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Many people find comfort in a good thunderstorm. The sound of the rain hitting the roof, the distant rumble of thunder, and the cool breeze can be incredibly relaxing. For a father and his 6-year-old son living in Florida, storms were always something to look forward to. Ever since the father was a child, he loved watching the sky light up, and he passed that same love down to his little boy. Whenever a storm rolled in, they had a special tradition. They would head out to their backyard gazebo to sit together, watch the clouds roll in, and listen to the rain. On a hot, stormy August night, a massive storm system began to sweep across their Florida neighborhood. As they sat in the living room, the first massive strike of lightning cracked across the sky, shaking the windows. The little boy jumped up immediately, his face lighting up with excitement. He looked at his dad and said, "Let us go sit outside." The father smiled, stood up, and followed his son out the back door. They ran through the pouring rain, getting pretty wet on the way before making it safely under the cover of their gazebo. The father had a nice setup under his backyard gazebo, which had a mini bar, a few comfortable wicker sofas, a television, and a mini fire pit. As they usually did, he turned on the fire pit and the TV, and they laid back to relax, listening to the sound of the pouring rain and the constant thunder. The thunder got louder as they sat out there, and the time between the flashes of lightning and cracks of thunder was getting shorter. The bulk of the storm was getting closer, and the lightning was getting so bright that it lit up the entire yard whenever it flashed. The backyard was very large, with dense woods covering 2 edges of it. After a particularly massive flash of lightning, the little boy suddenly pointed out toward the yard. The father asked what he saw, and the boy replied that someone was standing in the backyard. The father stood up and walked to the very edge of the gazebo, peering into the dark. He could not see anything at first, so he waited for another flash of lightning. The next few flashes were too small, but when the next earth-rumbling flash struck, he saw exactly what his son meant. There was indeed someone standing out in his backyard, right by the edge of the woods. The father told his son to go rush inside the house and turn on the backyard floodlights. The boy ran inside without question, and the father stood in place, keeping his eyes on the spot. 10 seconds later, the lights turned on, but the person was no longer there. The father went inside the house, locked all the doors, and kept the outside lights on. He turned on the front yard lights too. He did not want to panic his wife, so when she asked if they should call the police, he lied and told her the person had left. He claimed it was a woman, thinking it sounded less scary. They tried to distract themselves by watching a movie, and eventually, the mother tucked the boy into bed. But later, the father was startled to find his son standing at his bedroom door, terrified, saying there was someone at his bedroom window. The father pulled his son away from the doorway, looking at the window and waiting for the lightning. When it struck, no one was there, but he believed his son. He told his wife and child to stay inside while he went out to look. Even though his wife did not want him to, he grabbed a heavy wooden baseball bat from the closet and stormed out into the heavy rain. After turning all the lights back on, he searched the front of the house, then the side, and then the back. He looked under the patio tables, inside the gazebo, and under the deck. When he thought the backyard was clear, the last site to check was the right side of the house. As he began to walk toward that side, he instantly saw a person wearing a dark hood, peering around the corner of the house. He could only see half of their face and head, as the rest of their body was hidden behind the wall. It looked like a man. The father screamed, raised his bat, and charged toward the corner. The person immediately disappeared behind the corner. When the father rounded the corner, they were gone. He went back inside and told his family that he had chased the man away, though his wife was terrified to hear it was a man. He closed all the blinds in the house, and they were not bothered again that night. The boy was so scared that he slept in his parents' bed, and the father stayed awake, wondering who was lurking in the dark. In another town close by, a teenager was about to experience a very similar nightmare. The city where he lived almost never got any rainfall, so when they did, it was a very exciting event. Kids would run outside to play, farmers would celebrate, and everyone would enjoy the rare scenery. On this night, a big thunderstorm was rolling in. The teenager was playing a video game online with his friends when the storm hit. He knew it was coming, because everybody's microphones picked up the same massive sound of thunder at the same time. It was so loud he thought it was a gunshot or a firework. Then he saw the lightning outside his window and hopped over to his bed to watch the storm form. But what he saw across the street was unsettling. There was a tall man standing there, wearing a gray hoodie and jeans. He was just standing still in the rain. The teenager could not tell if the man was looking at him, because his face was obscured. Eventually, the man started walking down the street, which brought some relief, though the teenager still felt paranoid. About 15 minutes later, the storm had fully started. He told his friends he was leaving to go watch the storm from his porch. He walked out and stood under the porch, watching the rain and lightning. But when he looked down the street to his left, the man was there again, standing at the corner of the street. The teenager tried to ignore him, and after 5 minutes, he went back inside. As he opened the door, he looked back and saw that the man was gone. Inside the house, his younger siblings were playing and dancing. The teenager went back to his room, but instead of playing the game, he sat there feeling uneasy. Suddenly, his phone buzzed with 2 texts from an unknown number. The first text read, "Have you forgotten?" And the second read, "I know you did not." His first thought was the man he had seen outside, but he wondered how a stranger could have his number. He assumed his friends were pulling a prank on him, so he asked them in their group chat. They all swore they had nothing to do with it. Later that night at 12:19 there was a loud knock at the front door. It was way too late for visitors. He peered through the blinds, but the rain was coming down so hard it looked like a blanket of mist, blocking his view. Suddenly, a massive clap of thunder shook the house, causing him to bump his head against the glass. He saw a figure running off the porch, and he knew it was the same man from earlier. He wanted to call the police, but he had no proof. He decided to try and sleep, but about 3 hours later, a loud bang on his window woke him. He peeked through the blinds and saw the man with his hands pressed against the glass, staring in. The scariest part was his mouth, which was stretched into a giant maniacal smile that did not look human. The man stood there for a moment, then walked away. The next morning, the teenager found a note taped to his window that read, "Have you forgotten?" The third encounter happened to a young woman who was working late during a violent thunderstorm. It was about midnight when she finally left her job to drive home. She drove a small 2005 Ford Fusion, which was not built for handling severe weather and flooded roads. She took her usual route home, but the rain was so bad that even with her windshield wipers on the highest setting, she could barely see. She was going 40 miles per hour in a 55-mile-per-hour zone because the road was so hazardous. There were no other cars on the road. Suddenly, through the heavy sheets of water on her windshield, she saw someone dressed in white running across the road from one side of the woods to the other. She saw them almost too late and had to slam on her brakes and swerve. She lost control of the car, slid onto the grass, and crashed head-on into a large tree. The airbag deployed instantly, leaving her in complete shock. Her car was totaled, and she was stranded on a quiet, dark highway with no buildings nearby. She tried calling her brother and sister, but neither of them answered because they were asleep. With no other options, she called her father, who woke up and promised to drive out to help her immediately. He told her to lock her doors and stay inside the car. About 10 minutes passed, and she texted her father to see if he was close. He replied that he was. Her hazard lights were flashing, cutting through the dark rain. Suddenly, she felt an intense urge to look to her right. She turned and screamed at the top of her lungs, feeling her heart drop out of her body. There was a soaking wet man dressed in white, looking into her car. His eyes were squinted, and his mouth was hung wide open in a bizarre O-shape. He put his wet hands on the glass and began rubbing the window. She yelled at him to go away, but he grabbed the handle and tried to open the locked door. When it would not open, he began violently pounding his fists against the glass, keeping his mouth in that creepy O-shape. Terrified, she called her father back, crying that a man was trying to break into her car. Her father screamed through the phone, telling her to keep the doors locked and promising he was almost there. He stayed on the line as the man outside began hitting the window with his elbow, trying to shatter it. Fortunately, the glass held. Suddenly, she saw headlights pull up behind her car. It was her father. The man outside turned toward the newly arrived car, and as her father stepped out, he charged at the creep. The man in white tried to run toward the woods, but her father tackled him to the ground and violently beat him. He held him down in the pouring rain while the young woman called the police. Not long after, multiple police cruisers and a tow truck arrived, and the man was arrested. The police identified him as Marcus Green. Once Marcus Green was in custody, detectives began a thorough investigation to understand the full scope of his activities. When they searched his vehicle, they found a gray hoodie that matched the one worn by the man who had terrorized the teenager. But the most disturbing evidence was discovered when they searched his apartment. Detectives found a collection of wet clothes, including the white outfit from the highway crash, as well as several burner phones. They also recovered a handwritten notebook filled with detailed maps, logs, and photographs. As they went through the pages, they realized that Marcus Green had been systematically stalking multiple families in the region. He had hand-drawn maps of the Florida family's property, including the layout of their backyard gazebo and notes on the daily routines of the parents and their 6-year-old son. Next to the maps, he had written down descriptions of the son's bedroom window and detailed logs of when the family usually watched movies. The notebook also contained the address of the teenager who had received the creepy text messages. Police discovered that Marcus Green had stolen pieces of mail from the teenager's mailbox, using the information to look up the family's records online, and purchased the boy's personal phone number. The digital forensics on his burner phones confirmed that he had sent the messages saying, "Have you forgotten, and I know you did not." The investigation reconstructed Marcus Green's exact method of operation, revealing a highly calculated and disturbing pattern. He was a predator who had a dark obsession with severe weather. He monitored local weather forecasts and waited for the most intense thunderstorms to plan his stalking sessions. He realized that the heavy rain, wind, and thunder provided the perfect cover, drowning out the sound of his footsteps and allowing him to approach homes and windows completely undetected. He took a sick pleasure in the shock value of his actions, knowing that the sudden flashes of lightning would briefly reveal his presence to his victims, creating a terrifying jump scare effect. For the young woman in the Ford Fusion, his actions had been a deliberate trap. He had waited in the woods along that dark, isolated highway, knowing the storm would force drivers to slow down, and had intentionally run across the road to cause her to crash. His plan was to wait until she was trapped and helpless before forcing his way into her car. Armed with this mountain of evidence, the prosecution built an airtight case against him. During the trial, the teenage victim, the young woman, and her father all gave emotional testimonies. The jury was shown the notebook, the maps, and the digital logs. After a brief deliberation, Marcus Green was convicted of stalking, attempted burglary, and reckless endangerment, and was sentenced to a lengthy prison term with no possibility of parole. Even though Marcus Green was locked away behind bars, the emotional scars left on his victims were deep and lasting. The 6-year-old boy was left with a severe fear of the dark and the rain, unable to sleep in his own room during storms. His parents eventually sold their Florida home and moved to another state, hoping a fresh start would help him heal. The teenager could no longer enjoy playing video games without feeling a constant wave of paranoia, and his family also decided to relocate to a larger city for a sense of security. The young woman who had crashed her Ford Fusion struggled with severe driving anxiety, eventually selling her car and avoiding driving at night or during heavy rain altogether. The families were left with unanswered questions about why they had been chosen, but they found comfort in knowing that they had survived and that the predator was finally off the streets. Their experiences served as a haunting reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not creatures of legend, but real people waiting outside our windows in the dark. They are out there, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the perfect storm to strike, and we must always be vigilant. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. I grew up in a really small town in northern Pennsylvania called Wellsboro. It is a quiet place surrounded by massive state game lands. In our town, hunting season is not just a casual weekend hobby, it is a massive deal. In fact, the local school districts actually close down on the first day of rifle season, because they know that half of the town is going to be out in the woods anyway. My dad got me into hunting when I was about 12 years old, and by the time I was 23 years old, I was confident enough to go out into the woods completely by myself on a regular basis. This specific event happened during the late archery season in November of 2021. I remember the exact year because there was already a light dusting of fresh snow on the ground, which makes it much easier to track animal movements. I had special permission to hunt on a very large piece of private land owned by an older guy my dad knew from work. The property was about 70 acres of thick woods with a small clearing and an old logging trail running right through it. There was also an abandoned hunting cabin way back in the woods that nobody used anymore because the roof was starting to cave in. I had been out there maybe 4 or 5 times before, and I had never seen anyone else. On that morning, I arrived at the property around 5:15 while it was still completely pitch black outside. I parked my truck right where I always did, near a rusted iron gate, and walked into the dark woods with my headlamp turned on. The forest was dead quiet. I remember having this incredibly weird, unsettling feeling, like I was being watched before I even reached my tree stand, but I just blamed it on the typical paranoia of being alone in the dark woods. I climbed up into my tree stand about 20 feet in the air and waited for daylight to break. About an hour after sunrise, I noticed something that immediately bothered me. About 60 yards away, I saw another tree stand that had absolutely not been there before. I knew this property very well, and I was certain it was not there the previous weekend. It was one of those cheap metal ladder stands, and it looked old and weathered like it had been sitting in the elements for years. But there was no way I would have missed it before. What bothered me even more was that there were no footprints leading to it in the fresh snow, except for one single trail of prints that went from deep in the woods straight to the base of the stand. I sat there and watched that ladder stand for a long time, thinking maybe someone else had permission to hunt the land and just never mentioned it to me. Around 8 o'clock in the morning, I saw a sudden flash of movement near that stand. At first my heart jumped because I thought it was a deer, but I was dead wrong. I quickly realized it was a person standing directly behind a tree. This person was not wearing any camouflage or orange safety gear. He was just wearing a dirty gray hoodie and dark pants. He was standing completely still, and he was looking straight in my direction. I did not know if he actually saw me at first, but then he slowly raised his arm and gave me a wave. It was not a friendly or warm wave. It was more of a cold, deliberate wave, like he was just letting me know that he saw exactly where I was. I gave him a small, awkward wave back, thinking maybe he was just a local who did not have proper gear. After about a minute of this, he stepped back behind the tree. I expected him to walk out the other side, but he never did. I waited and watched, but he never reappeared. I assumed he must have walked deeper into the thick brush. But the strange thing was that I never heard a single footstep in the quiet woods. Around 10 o'clock, I decided to climb down from my stand to stretch my legs and walk around a bit. I slowly walked towards the tree where the man had been standing. When I reached the spot, my stomach dropped. The snow all around that tree was completely undisturbed, except for my own tracks walking in. There were no boot prints leading away from the tree, just the same single line of footprints I had seen earlier, leading straight to the base of the weathered ladder stand. I followed those prints, and they stopped right at the metal ladder. I looked up, expecting to see him sitting up there, but the stand was completely empty. The metal seat had a thin, smooth layer of fresh snow on it that did not look disturbed at all. That made absolutely no sense to me. I remember feeling my chest get tight and a cold wave of panic washed over me. I decided it was time to head back towards my own tree stand. On the way back, I noticed something small tied to a branch at about eye level. It was a thin strip of orange fabric, clearly torn from a hunting vest, tied in a tight knot. I thought maybe someone had marked a trail, but then I saw another strip about 15 feet away, and then another. They were tied at different heights, like someone had been marking something very specific in the woods. That was the first time I seriously considered just packing up my gear and leaving. Around noon, I walked back to my truck to eat some lunch and warm up my hands. Nothing unusual happened while I was sitting inside the truck, but I could not shake the intense feeling that I was being watched from the dark tree line. I almost started the engine to drive home, but I managed to convince myself that I was just overthinking things. I walked back into the woods around 2 o'clock in the afternoon to sit in my stand until dark. This is where things got really bad. About an hour before sunset, I heard what sounded like slow, deliberate footsteps behind me in the dry leaves. The steps were too heavy and too far apart to be an animal. I slowly turned around in my stand, expecting to see another hunter walking through the brush, but about 30 yards behind my stand, I saw the exact same guy from earlier. This time, he was much closer, and I could see his face clearly in the gray light. His beard looked patchy and incredibly dirty, and his skin was extremely pale, like he had not been outside in the daylight in weeks. What really bothered me was that he was smiling at me, but not in a normal way. He was just barely showing his teeth, and his eyes were completely wide and vacant. He was holding something in his right hand. At first, I thought it was just a stick, until I saw the bright yellow and black handle. It was a long screwdriver. The man did not say a single word. He just stood there in the snow, staring me down with that creepy, unchanging smile. I tried to sound brave, so I yelled down to him and asked if he had permission to be on this property. He did not answer me. He just kept staring. After about 10 seconds of this heart-pounding stare-off, he slowly turned around and walked away into the thick trees. That should have been the exact moment I packed up and ran, but I made the foolish decision to stay in my stand until the legal shooting light ended. Right after sunset, I climbed down as fast as I could and started walking back towards my truck. In that moment, I deeply regretted not leaving while I still had some sunlight in the sky. About halfway to my truck, I started noticing those orange cloth strips again. But this time, they were not just tied to the tree branches. Some of them were tied to small, sharpened sticks that had been pushed deep into the snowy ground. But the thing that genuinely scared me was that one of the sticks had something hanging from it. It was a dead squirrel. It had been hung by a piece of wire threaded through its back legs, dangling in the cold air. Underneath the hanging squirrel, someone had used their boot to draw a rough, perfect circle in the snow. That was the second time I seriously considered running. As I kept walking, I started noticing more of these sticks in the snow. They were not just squirrels. I saw a dead rabbit, and then a dead crow, all hung in the exact same gruesome way, like markers or maybe a direct threat meant just for me. I started walking much faster, almost running through the dark woods. About 100 yards from my truck, I saw something leaning against a large pine tree that made me stop dead in my tracks. It was my own backpack. It was the backpack that I had left sitting up in my tree stand earlier that day. I had not brought it down with me when I climbed down. The pack was zipped wide open, and all of my personal items were laid out neatly in the snow. My hunting knife, my flashlight, and my extra arrows were all lined up in a perfect straight line, like someone had taken a precise inventory of my gear. That was the moment of absolute horrifying realization. Someone had been close enough to my tree stand to climb all the way up to the platform, steal my backpack, and lay my things out in the snow, and they had done all of this without me ever knowing. I grabbed my gear as fast as I could and jogged the rest of the way to the clearing. When I finally reached the clearing, my truck's driver's side door was standing wide open. I knew for a fact that I had locked it. Nothing inside appeared to be stolen, but my registration papers were now sitting on the passenger seat instead of the locked glove box. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. I looked in the side mirror towards the dark tree line, and there he was, standing just inside the woods. The guy in the gray hoodie was still wearing that awful vacant smile. He raised his hand, but instead of waving, he pointed at me and slowly dragged his finger across his own throat. I slammed my foot on the gas, spinning gravel all the way back to the road. I told the property owner what happened, and he contacted the game commission. About 2 weeks later, he called my dad and said officers had found a makeshift shelter deep on the property. Inside, they found animal bones and stolen hunting gear. I never hunted there again, and I never hunt alone anymore. This next story takes place in November of last year, when I was on a hunting trip with my grandfather to Crockett, Texas. I do not really get to see my grandfather that often, because he is always busy running his own company. So, when he told me he wanted to go on a hunting trip, I was more than happy to pack my bags and go. I will say that I personally do not like the act of hunting, but I absolutely love to camp and explore new places. I had never been to this particular land lease that he was taking us to, so I figured it would be a great experience. I took some time off work and went down to Crockett. As we pulled up, I noticed there was no real entryway. It was just a narrow dirt track with an iron gate on the side of a busy freeway. My grandfather got out of the truck to lift the gate, and then we headed down a long, winding dirt road through the thick woods until we finally reached a clearing with an old house sitting in the middle. While we were driving, he told me his father had built the house, and they used it to go hunting, or just to relax and take a break from life. It was incredibly peaceful inside the woods, and I could barely hear the cars from the freeway. It seemed like the perfect getaway. After we pulled into the driveway, we unpacked the truck and cooked a simple dinner for the night. Everything inside the old house seemed completely normal. There were old metal beds where we put our clean sheets and blankets, an old television with a built-in video cassette recorder, and the kitchen stove was an old-fashioned model. After we finished eating, we went to sleep around 8:30, so we could wake up just before dawn to head out to one of the blinds. As I started to fall asleep, I heard a quiet scratching noise coming from one of the windows with a screen on it. I did not think anything of it, assuming it was just a branch, and I fell asleep fairly soon after that. The next morning, my grandfather woke me up to get dressed so we could go to the blind. After we got there, we settled in and surveyed the large, open clearing. We did not see anything for a couple of hours, so we decided to take a quick nap. I woke up after only being asleep for a few minutes, and I picked up my binoculars to look at the far tree line. The tree line was about 1.5 miles from our blind, but as I swept the lens across the trees, I froze. I saw someone peeking around the trees right at the edge of the woods, looking directly at us like they knew we were there. It felt like they had been watching us the entire time. I was thoroughly convinced someone was watching us, so I quickly woke up my grandfather. He took the binoculars and looked, but right then, a large herd of deer came out into the clearing. He just chuckled and told me there was nothing to worry about, saying it was just the local wildlife playing tricks on me. I was incredibly irritated, to say the least. I knew exactly what I had seen, and it looked like a person, not a deer. After about 30 minutes, he shot one of the deer, and we took it back to the house to clean it and start skinning it. After we gutted the deer, it was about 3 o'clock, and we decided we wanted to head into town to get some supplies for dinner. So, we hung the deer up on the wooden frame in the yard and left for the store. When we got back, we saw deep claw and bite marks all over the animal's body. My grandfather and I just looked at each other in complete shock. He looked at me and said we were going on a night hunt. I asked him what for, and he told me he thought it was just coyotes, but I did not think that was the case. This did not seem normal at all. But we grabbed our flashlights and our rifles and went out scouting into the dark woods. We walked and talked for a solid 45 minutes before we heard anything. We got really close to the dark tree line, and I suddenly turned my flashlight and saw something peeking out at us again from behind a tree. The second it realized I had noticed it, it quickly hid. I tried everything in my power not to scream, so I did a light whistle to my grandfather and waved him over to where I saw it. He whispered for me to stay put and watch his back. He walked into the dark woods with his gun raised and quickly disappeared into the trees. I stood there alone for what felt like forever, waiting to hear something. After about 10 minutes, I heard a loud gunshot. I ran into the woods towards the sound and saw a dead coyote with a mutilated deer carcass next to it. I breathed a huge sigh of relief seeing my grandfather was okay, but he told me the coyote had noticed him and looked like it was about to attack, so he had no choice but to shoot. We sat there for a moment before we heard a sudden rustling in the distance, followed by the most horrifying blood-curdling scream I have ever heard. It was not human, and it was definitely not any animal I recognized, but I did not care to find out. We booked it back to the house as fast as we could, while hearing intense, heavy footsteps and loud, ragged breathing coming from directly behind us in the dark. It felt like we would never make it back, but we finally did. We slammed the door shut and locked every entrance. All we could hear were weird, guttural screeching sounds and heavy breathing right outside the front door. Whatever it was began to get frustrated and slammed its body against the heavy door a couple of times. My grandfather got tired of being scared. He raised his rifle and shot through the wooden door a couple of times. The bullets must have hit whatever was on the other side, because it let out another one of those terrifying high-pitched screeches, and then we heard it run away into the woods. As soon as we could catch our breath, I called the police and told them what happened. They were obviously very skeptical of our story, but when the deputy arrived, he saw the bullet holes and the claw marks, and he did not know what to think either. He seemed pretty unsettled by the whole scene. Nothing ever came back from that call, but needless to say, we probably won't ever be going back to that house again. At this point, you might think these kinds of experiences are just isolated incidents of bad luck. But for 3 friends who set out into the mountains one cold November, a simple weekend getaway turned into a nightmare that would leave them questioning their own safety and their own humanity. Kyle had been asking Connor and me to go hunting with him in the mountains for 2 years. We always brushed it off because neither of us really knew what we were doing, and hunting was never something I was interested in. Kyle was the kind of guy who actually knew how to do things, though. He knew how to gut a deer, split firewood, start a fire without light or fluid, and somehow look completely comfortable sleeping on the hard ground. Connor and I were definitely not those kinds of guys. We liked the idea of a hunting trip far more than the actual reality of it. Sitting around drinking beers in the mountains for a weekend sounded great, but hiking miles into the thick woods, waking up before sunrise, and killing an animal did not appeal to us. But Kyle finally talked us into it late one November. He told us that rifle season was open, and the weather would be cold enough to keep all the bugs down. He knew a great spot in the mountains where he had hunted before, and almost never saw anyone else. If I am being completely honest, he mainly convinced us with the promise of good food and cold beer in the middle of the mountains. The plan was simple. We would drive up Friday morning, hike into the woods, set up camp, and spend the weekend hunting. Connor agreed to the trip, because he would agree to almost anything if it sounded like it would make a good story later. I agreed because I did not want to be the only one still saying no, and the fear of missing out was very strong with me. We loaded Kyle's truck before sunrise and drove a few hours into the mountains. During the drive, Kyle kept talking us through everything like we were in some beginner class. He showed us how to keep the rifles pointed in a safe direction, how to walk without making noise, what deer signs looked like, and how to spot little trails through the thick woods that I never would have noticed on my own. After parking the truck at a turnout near an old logging road, we hiked into the woods for an annoying amount of time. Kyle said it was only a few miles, but it felt like 10. By the time we finally reached the area he wanted, my shoulders were incredibly sore, and my legs were shaking on the steeper parts of the trail. We found a flat spot near a small bubbling creek and set up our camp there. Kyle did most of the hard work because Connor and I were honestly useless. By the time it got dark, we had the tents up, a nice fire going, and a little ring of logs pulled around it to sit on. That first night actually felt perfect for a while. The woods were dead quiet, except for the fire popping and the creek moving over the rocks. We were drinking beers, talking about old high school memories, and making fun of how bad Connor was at putting up a simple tent. It was a rare, amazing moment, and I remember thinking I finally understood why people loved doing this. Then, out of the blue, we heard a terrifying scream somewhere deep in the woods. We all stopped talking at once. Kyle tilted his head and listened intently, while Connor laughed a little and said it sounded like a woman getting murdered. Kyle said it could just be a fox, explaining that foxes can make bizarre sounds that sound exactly like a screaming woman. I desperately wanted the fox explanation to be true, because that scream did not sound like any animal to me. Because the sound was so far away, it was easy to convince ourselves that it was just wildlife. After about a minute or two, we started talking again. Though we were not nearly as relaxed as before, every one of us kept pausing to listen to the dark, even Kyle. About 5 minutes later, the scream came again. However, this time it was so much closer that our conversation died instantly. It sounded like it came from maybe a football field away. If that, it was loud enough that there was absolutely no joking around after that. It sounded exactly like a woman screaming, a long, desperate cry that ended all at once. Connor stood up and stared into the pitch black beyond the warm firelight. Kyle got to his feet as well. Then Connor called out into the dark, asking if someone out there needed help. I told him that was a stupid thing to do, and then we all just stood there, staring into the woods and listening for an answer. Nothing came back. Kyle looked uncomfortable in a way I had never seen before. He said if it was a person, they probably would have answered us. Then he said we needed to put the fire out immediately and get into the tents. He did not explain why, but it was obvious. The bright fire was basically a beacon showing exactly where we were. We put the fire out fast, climbed into our tents with our rifles close by, and tried to sleep. I barely slept at all. Every little noise my brain picked up on made me freeze. At some point I must have passed out anyway, because when I woke up, it was gray outside and freezing cold. When the urge to pee got too bad, I finally stepped out of my tent. Right away, I noticed that our camp chairs were tipped over, and one of our coolers had been turned completely sideways. A grocery bag with our snacks in it was torn open and dragged a few feet. Kyle's backpack was lying near the cold fire ring, when it had definitely been leaning against a tree when we went to bed. I called for Kyle and Connor, and they both came out of their tents. Kyle looked around and immediately said a bear had probably come through our camp. That made sense to me. It was the easiest and most logical explanation. We had not hung our food properly, and there were food smells all over the camp. The weird thing was that not much was actually gone. Stuff was moved around more than it was eaten or stolen. Still, Kyle sounded confident, and I wanted a normal explanation badly enough to accept it. He said we should move our camp deeper into the woods, both because of the bear and because he wanted to get closer to the area he planned to hunt that day. So we packed up and moved. Our second campsite was farther from the creek, and located in a much thicker patch of woods along a steep slope. It somehow felt a lot more isolated, even though it probably was not that much farther in. We spent most of the day hunting. Kyle split us up but kept us within sight at first, showing us where to sit and how to watch the tree lines and openings. Connor treated the whole thing like a game at first, but by mid-afternoon even he had settled down. There is something about sitting in the woods for hours with a rifle that completely changes your mood, whether you want it to or not. Late in the day, Kyle shot a deer. It happened incredibly fast. I only heard the loud crack of his rifle and then Kyle yelling for us. When Connor and I reached him, the deer was down in a patch of brush about 40 yards away. It was a decent-sized buck. Seeing a dead deer up close was very different than seeing one in a photo. Kyle had us drag it back to camp, which was miserable, exhausting work. Once we got back to camp, Kyle started field dressing the deer, showing us how to skin and break it down. Connor acted interested, but I could tell he was forcing it. I just felt sick. The smell was awful, and the whole process felt brutal. I grew up a massive animal lover, so the idea of me being on a hunting trip was already pretty crazy. Kyle was completely in his element, though, explaining every part of it. By the end, there were chunks of meat bagged in the cooler, and a bloody mess off to the side that I tried not to look at. That night we drank again, partly to celebrate, and partly because Connor and I needed it after helping with the deer. Kyle cut off some backstrap and cooked it over the open fire, and it tasted surprisingly good. But as our successful day was coming to a close, the terrifying scream came back. It was distant at first, maybe even farther than the first night, but the second I heard it, my stomach dropped. We all knew that sound now. Nobody said fox and nobody laughed. We waited in silence, hoping that would be the end of it, but it was not. A few minutes later, the scream came again, much closer, and it sounded like it was moving directly towards our camp. It was fully dark by then, and the firelight made everything beyond the trees look pitch black. I felt like whoever was making that sound could see us perfectly, while we could see absolutely nothing. Kyle stood up and grabbed his rifle. He was trying to act calm, but I could hear his hands shaking. In a sudden burst of drunk confidence, he raised his rifle and fired a few rounds into the air. He started yelling into the woods like a maniac, trying to sound bigger and crazier than whatever was out there. Connor and I laughed nervously, but the laughter died instantly. A moment later, the scream came again, even closer. It sounded like it was just a few yards outside the edge of our camp, right beyond the trees where the light ended. The warning shots had not scared them off at all. We put the fire out faster than the night before, plunging the camp into absolute darkness. We scrambled into our tents with our rifles. I lay there wide awake, listening to the woods. Then I heard footsteps, not walking, but running fast and hard around our tents. Something brushed against the side of my tent, a dragging scratch, like someone was running an object along the fabric as they moved past. I was too silence, terrified to call out. Then it went completely still. That silence was the worst part. A full minute passed before that horrifying scream exploded right in the middle of our campsite. It was so loud it did not sound human. Connor screamed, I yelled, and Kyle fired a shot through the roof of his tent into the air. The blast was deafening. Immediately after, we heard fast footsteps tearing off through the woods, getting farther away until they disappeared. We all crawled into Kyle's tent, holding our rifles and flashlights until morning. At dawn, we packed up without even discussing hunting. We hiked back to the truck in silence, driving away with a heavy sense of relief, but also a lingering, haunting guilt. We still wonder to this day if someone out there had truly needed our help, or if something much darker was waiting for us in the shadows. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.